In the previous lesson, we took a look at the Continental Army led by Washington retreating from New York. In fact, they would retreat from Long Island, they would retreat from Brooklyn, they would retreat from Manhattan. John Glover actually defended the retreat from Manhattan, and he and his 750 men did so very bravely. But the point is not so much who did what as it is the fact that they were on the retreat. They were going backwards, it seemed. They were losing territory, and they were not able to really inflict much against the British. In fact, from August, the time that they were really withdrawing from New York, all the way up until November, Washington would lose essentially 4 major engagements, 4 major opportunities to fight the British, which he knew he could not win. Not only that, but he would lose 2 fortresses. His army, which at the summer peak had been roughly around 20,000, would be withered down to about 3,500. They became nicknamed the Shadow Army. To make matters worse, one of the other generals in the Continental Army who was stationed elsewhere, a man by the name of General Charles Lee, was captured and imprisoned by the British. What's interesting about this is Lee had incredible military experience, was a man who wanted to be in command of the army, and many thought that he should be. And so here he was, the great general that many people thought. He had been captured, and Washington was in charge, but Washington was a failure. This was the challenge that Washington faced as he went into the very end of that year, 1776. He desperately needed a victory. So he planned a victory. He planned to attack the Hessians, those mercenaries from Germany, men who were known to be such professional soldiers that they slept in their uniforms with their cartridge already ready to go, and so they could go immediately into the fight. He decided the best bet was to go on the night of Christmas, and on the following morning, after the Hessians had spent the previous night and day celebrating, that he would attack at dawn, and he would take them by surprise. But still, the question was, could he successfully do it? On Christmas Day, having made all the plans and waiting for the time to come that he would actually set out, his friend Benjamin Rush came to him in his tent, there where the army was camped in Delaware, getting ready to cross over into New Jersey. And there he found Washington writing these small notes in which he simply said victory or death on each note. It was a note that was going to be given to each of his officers. In other words, he was trying to tell them, this is it. If we do not achieve a victory here, this is the end of our army. This is the end of our entire cause for independence, and we will return to the slavery that Britain has intended for us. Now, the plan was this. The plan was that night, the army would set out and they would divide into 3 different groups. Each of these groups would be led by a commander. Washington himself would lead one. And each commander had a watch that was synchronized with the other commanders, so they could all cross the river at the same time and all arrive in Trenton at the same time. However, the weather was not exactly cooperative that night. It was incredibly snowy, it was incredibly windy, there were great ice flows throughout the river itself. And so 2 of the commanders decided it's far too dangerous and our guns are going to be probably locked up from the cold and snow, that we better not cross. Surely Washington has also called off the attack. So 2 of the commanders decided not to go. Only Washington went. They crossed the river. There's that famous painting of him crossing the Delaware River, for example. And when they made it to the other side, they found things like their guns had essentially locked up or frozen from the snow and ice. And so they had to turn to the bayonet. By the time that the sun was about to rise, they had reached Trenton, where some 1,500 Hessians lay sleeping. But they had this attack, or they had the element of surprise on hand when they attacked. And the battle actually was over in a roughly 45 minutes, as the Americans quickly took that Hessian post, quickly captured them, even though the Hessians, with all of their professional soldiery, were able to counterattack 3 different times. Now, this was not the end of the story. As great as this victory was, Washington knew that they weren't really finished yet. He knew that they needed to end the year even stronger than this. He also recognized that there was a British deployment up in Princeton, not far from Trenton. And he recognized that this British regiment could be defeated. And so he asked his men to serve with him and go and attack this place. The reason he asked was because it was after the end of the year. And these men had signed up for contracts. The Continental Army soldiers only served 1 year initially. And their contracts were had all expired at the end of the previous year, at 1776. And so George Washington said, listen, men, this is an opportunity for us to continue victory. And so he had his soldiers give the drum roll. He had his officers call to the front any men who would volunteer to stay. And the story goes that none of them volunteered. None of them stepped forward. They were all ready to go home, which is understandable. Well, Washington then said this, and history does record this for us. He said, my brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you can probably never do under any other circumstance. The story goes the drum roll came a second time, and this time all of the men stepped forward. Nathanael Greene said this, God Almighty inclined their hearts to listen to the proposal, and they engaged anew. It's one of the miracles you see in the War of Independence. One of those things that you usually see in a movie and you say, that would never happen. Only it did. As a result, they did march to Princeton. They had a brilliant strategy. They set up a camp in which they made a lot of noise and lit a lot of fires and kept a few men behind to continue making noise, so that the British thought they were at that camp. Meanwhile, the Army circumnavigated Princeton, went in essentially through the back door, caught the British by surprise, and captured the entire garrison. Washington, experiencing the second victory at the beginning of this new year, 1777, wanted to go on and fight even more. But his officers told him, better stop here. You've won incredible victories. Let's not finish with a possible loss. Washington, ever wise, ever willing to listen to his men, agreed with them, and the army retired to its winter camp. But still, they had an incredible taste of victory that was led by the patience and the vision of Washington. That Washington's leadership and the Continental Army is what actually won the war. Not the control of the Hudson, not the control of New York City or Philadelphia.